If a person commits a heinous crime, is it possible that the punishment they receive in this life from being in prison could purify worse suffering for a future life? Could this be a motivation for wanting a person to have life imprisonment? 미세벨레 체소나 미세벨레 체소나 참행아
참에 자잖아.
참에 체소나 드니 저 총강을 되나 드니 레디 닥루도그베 레디
정관 대배. 정관 대배. 영화 다그르베세.
네버 다그르베스 아니 디 체창 드니 총강 그사 마시 바도 되나 야보요라 야그요라
정가를 대비 영화 답에 영화요 말이. 그러. 영화 답을 다 지단 참에 제비 영화세 아주 남배샤서나 영화 테라 샤바가 답아주고 거래스. 샤바자. 그러. 다 유단 때문에 유적이 답아대 유코랑 같은 그러와. 뭐코랑 같은 게. 아니 남배치올라잖아 참에 제나양 아니야 샤바체나 타야 그러와 맞제다그랑 그 파사바레데 다네 아니 남라시니 주슈그 저우터벨로지나 히와레스.
So no, not necessarily, because there are two things going on here. One, the commission of the heinous crime. Let's take, for example, the 5 crimes or sins of immediate retribution, killing mother, father, etc. Those kinds of heavy negative karmas, there's no guarantee that being in prison is going to do much to purify you of them during that time. If you don't apply, say, the opponent powers of confession and so forth as a means of purifying them, then there's no certainty that that time in prison would do much to remove that kind of heavy fault from you. And then, on the other hand, there's the simple laws of the country that are a different sort of matter altogether. So there's two things going on here. One is the Buddhist, specifically Buddhist kind of attitude towards negative karma and how it's purified. And then there's just conventional worldly legal matters as well. So the two are not necessarily the same or related. Within samsara, are there examples of happy feelings which are not in the nature of suffering? Korwala dewe tsorwa dungagi rangshin le deva yor.
그래서
Korwala
거기 대화라.
Korwala dewe tsorwa dungagi rangshin
동아란시.
임백캡을 배서.
거기 대화라.
Korwala tsoi dewa.
거기 처음이 대화라. 동아지라시 배척을 했어요.
capable.
어디 쳐버리고.
Yes. I'm sorry. The question was placed the opposite way. No, there are none. There are no samsaric sensations of pleasure or happy feelings, whatever, that are not in the nature of suffering.
All virtuous karmas that resulted in happiness would be in the nature of suffering also?
Dini gewele chungwe dewa. Gewele dile chungwe drebu dewa yorba.
대화를
Yang
그 소환 대화를 소환 대화를 소환 대화고 동아지라시. 동아 말이 소환 대화데 대화 소환 대화데 소환 가서 초소 숨긴 안에 대화를 동아 말이 이나야 소환 대화데 동아지라시래. 그다 대하고 그러봐.
So yeah.
내 동성아 가서 다시 소환 대화 타녀도 매도시 꼬았다 봐 미샤고 어디
So, okay. Let's see. So samsaric pleasure is pleasure, but it is still of the nature of suffering. As we said earlier today, it's not appropriate to say that there's no samsaric pleasure. It's simply not. It's simply that pleasure is of the nature of suffering. So where it said here that pleasurable sensations, to say that there is no such thing even conventionally as pleasurable sensations is wrong. It's a underestimation of what it is, but it's still of the nature of suffering. Since we do not experience real happiness and are seduced by our samsaric idea of pleasure, how can we know or even have an idea of what uncontaminated happiness would be? Corolla 대화친 랑첨바 냠용 요마를 배스
대화 랑잠바를
대화 랑첨바
대화 랑잠바 세대 가르레스나 다시 나임바 동아 칠치어봐라 대화랑 뭐 받대라 대화랑 잠바 쓰고 와레스 동아 칠치어봐라 대화를 뭐 받대라 대화랑 잠바 쓰고 와레스 동아 칠치에서 가나 빼나 제비 동아 지냐 제비 동아 제디 가나 세 세디 잠바 아니 제비 동아지 마 아니 칠천이 눈도 주고 와라 제비 동아지 마 눈도 주디 가나 대화랑 뭐 봐. 대화를 뭐 봐대 대화를 안 잡아서 드리다 동아 치쳐봐라 대화만 봐도 콜라 세세비 대화대 대화원에 전년지나 세 가지 세나 대화 요구래 세세니 제위 동아 제위 년바대라 아니 세사봐 야나 가서 장위 동아지 년바대라 아니 최대한지 잡아 토마 최하디 가나 대념 지어라. 대념대 가서래 장위 대화 실제 봐라. 대화랑 말에 마도 뉴도 침 봐라. 그러와 콜레 대화랑 잡아요 말이지.
대화랑 잡아요 말이.
대화랑 잡아요나 아니 최대 치듬 대장 대화 요구래. 드니 양 차도 신이 동안 못 주고도 와. 차바체. 그러와 하고서 아니 동아 칠지어발라 더 차비 장위 동아 칠지어발라 대화랑 엄바자 마도 콜라 대화랑 잡아지요 말레스 대화랑 잡아요나 안에 대가서 최대 치점 대장 대화 요구할래 대매봐 아니야 차비 동아 지는기도 와.
So what we're saying here is that that this samsaric happiness, which is we're saying that it's really just, it's not real happiness or real pleasure, because it's simply the alleviation of suffering. What that means is that we, for example, if you take hunger and thirst, as we said earlier, when you're hungry, you're experiencing some suffering of hunger, and eating the food there's this momentary alleviation of that suffering, and we take that sensation as if it was real happiness or real pleasure, let's say. However, if that experience was real pleasure, then the more we continued to indulge in it, the pleasure would continue to increase without any interruption. But in fact, as we know, if we continue to indulge in that eating, then we'll just eventually come to a point of actual suffering, of obvious suffering. It'll be clear and apparent to us that it's unpleasant. Then, ngatu Korea 대화라 마톡 시기민두게 ngatu 그렇게 요르바.
먼저 코에 대화 모두 대화 싶어 두게 했어요.
시기민두 제차 디 작체기 대화 디 카르스
사제 좀 좋아도도 사제 대화래.
작체기 대화를 삭메기 대화 카르스
아멘 대화 야라는 말도
이 ngatu 코킨디 작메기 대화 카르스 카르스 시기래.
삼매지 대화 토와 제발라 아니 로종체 냠리체 아니 용고래.
So the last part of this is how, since we only have these samsaric ideas of pleasure, how can we come or know or even have an idea of what uncontaminated happiness would be? The answer is you need to study it. And then having studied it, you need to practice it. Practice in order to have it. Dini tarbatosona dini tarbatosona dini dewa rangsimba ragir base.
대화를 안 잡았다는 건 저를 두가 연발을 다 먹고도. 대화를 안 잡은 건 저 두가.
So now what we're using is the word real happiness is la 건강에 하고 무슨
대화를 안 잡은 건 저를 두세. 동아 치르쳐 봐라. 아니 동아 치르쳐 봐라. 대화를 뭐 봐. 대화를 안 잡아 이봐. 다시 대 더송아. 야.
대화 랑심바스나
동아 치르쳐 봐라. 대화를 뭐 봐. 대화 동아랑 스송아. 대화 나서 동아 치르쳐 봐잖아. 샤바 자지. 다지 가자란제 민지. 리란제니 다지 가자란제 민지. 동아 치르쳐 봐라. 샤바 잠데 세대. 사실 대화 친사송아.
대화 랑심
대화를 안 잡아 세대. 동아 치르쳐 봐라. 대화를 뭐 봐. 대화를 안 잡아.
드니 랑칭이 진이 가리오레시 there.
나
랑칭 소디
쟤는 대화를 안 잡아 세대. 동아 치르쳐 봐. 대화를 안 잡아 마도 랑시지 대화지 매와.
랑시기 대화 마
랑시지 대화요 봐.
이는 랑칭 직디 하고마송 디
동아 치르쳐 봐. 대화를 안 잡아 쓰고 하다.
이는 디 랑칭기 고등 가리오.
랑제 제가 동아 치르쳐 와. 임 치르쳐 봐라. 대화를 뭐 봐. 인산 대화를 안 잡아.
대화 랑칭 바 이는 디
랑제세 같이 랑제 말해.
같이 랑칭 바래 디 하고
같이 랑제 말해. 동아 치르쳐 봐. 대화 고랑 속이도 와. 동아 치르쳐 봐라. 대화를 뭐 봐. 대화를 안 잡아 쓰고 그랬어.
지금 랑칭기 디 랑칭기 진이 가리오레 디 가리스나 디
란젠 천에서는 같이 란젠 속으로 빌려서 그 말이.
디 하고서
동아 치르쳐 봤더라. 대화를 뭐 봤더라. 대화를 안 잡아.
대화 응원보
대화를 뭐 봤을까나. 대화 들어오지 양고 알아 봐. 코란 시기 대화요. 아무 동아 치르쳐 봐라. 대화를 뭐 봐. 네. 그러마 침바 용고 알아 봐. 这位年把得了3对个落침바치
선부치
용고도 와. 장외年把了12点就干了. 아니 로 침바치 용고도 와. 대화치. 어딜 대화랑 좀 봤어.
I made a mistake, I think, in translating that. This
아 대화랑 좀 고라 맞주는 그래. 랑자 말자. 동아 칠죠 봐라 대화를 놀라 간소래. 대화랑 뭐 봤담도. 대화를 통화담도. 대화 통화담도. 그래.
So this word here, there's a technical term which usually refers to the thing which is negated by reason, by evidence, when one's investigating whether or not things have intrinsic identity. But it's being used here in a technical sense in reference to this kind of happiness. So this happiness is, it appears to us as if it was actual, or, it appears as happiness, but in fact, it's merely the alleviation of suffering. So that sort of satisfaction, which is effectively relief from some form of suffering that we're experiencing, like hunger or thirst and so forth, is given this special name here of, and I don't know how to translate it, sorry, it's that kind of happiness.
야.
근데 그래서 타바토스는 그래서 대화 진입아 라기를 배야 디 코로의 둥어기 각마토요.
아바토디 코이 동아 시위 아니 시대 차이 버터고.
시대.
시위 대화.
So when you obtain liberation, then you attain a kind of happiness which is peace, and that is the cessation of suffering.
Oh, yeah.
What is the difference in Tibetan and English between yeshe and sherab and gnosis and wisdom? Then Puketang Injila yeshidang sherab. Yeshidang sherab ki kebakariyo.
그래다.
Yeshidang sherab.
제일 잡아요 말에 이시라 시와 잡는다 망보요 말에 시라불라 코랑 요라 쥐어박 그러봐 저 이지남시 코르도 좀 시와 건가 이시래 아 이시 아니 시라불 생한 거를 요라 쥐어박 칠해진 그쯤 주지라스 거 그러봐
말에 이 예시
이시에 돼 이시 시와
말에
나
예시
이시에
네
이시라 시라인 배척 말에
작맥이 예시
사맥이 시라 시라인 배척 사맥이 시와 건가 이시 저봐도 사맥이 이시스 그래 내 시라인 배척 말에
이렇게 말 시럽당 이시리
시라보다 이시 발총 그래 시라보다 이시왕 왜 시라보다 용 그래 시라보 건가라 이시와 이 배쳐요 말에
뭐 이기 쉐브 말에게 디
이시세니 와인이 지나기 이시잖아 엔다가래 시라보다 이시 용 그래
시럽을 예시 용
예수 용 그래
라
와인이 지나기 이시잖아 시라보다 이시 용 그래 이시라 시라보 용 고고 말해
예시를 시럽 용 말해. So if something is gnosis, it is necessarily wisdom, but if something is wisdom, it is not necessarily gnosis.
그래서 어야 다 다진데 단다 쉬어야 되라래 그러와 초와를 대화도 거도 미자 오세 예와니 난주제비 시자와라 시와 차오 세야 돼다 다중에 쉬어야 되래 그러와 패신바이 대화라 도바라 주와 치다 대신도 치다 동아 패신라 도바라 주와 여바 많이 다 다시 될라야 돼 패신바이 대화라 아니 도바라 주와 세가나 아니 동 대화 패와라 초안 대화 다시 주와 나시 전에 장위 동아지 nem바텔라 아니 가소래 장위 동아데 야마 아니 저때인데 가나 장위 대화데 마 아니 마 추도 치봐라 그러나 패신바이 대화랴 장위 동아데 바 년이 대화 권도 패디 가나 탈 대화데 도바요 아래 패신바이 대화라 도바르 주와 지다와 그래서 왔다 진짜다 지다 동아 패신라 도버 좋아요 많이 동아 패디가라 가져요 그 오지나 동아 코랑게 나는 올 때봐 다시 원보다 가디이나 원보 까르보데 가보이나 가보당시 전에 가나 동아데 가디이나 동아가 뭐 되거를 말도 코용 올 아니 가서 내용 올 펴줘요 말이지 내와디 치점 땡디 가나 타를 아니 동아가 뭐 그래 자자그 소화돼 왔다
So then, with respect to the relationship between happiness and suffering, it's expressed also in a verse in the 400 verses on the practice of yoga, as mentioned earlier. And there it says that with respect to happiness, and now this is referring to contaminated happiness or contaminated pleasure, the sensations which are contaminated forms of happiness, contaminated pleasure. These sensations, when they increase in character, that is, over time, as we mentioned earlier, with the case of, like, let's take a cold, for example. If you're cold and you place yourself in the proximity to heat, then at a certain point, there's an alleviation of that suffering of being cold, but eventually the heat will induce the sensation of displeasure, suffering. So that's the way it works with all forms of contaminated happiness, that when one experiences them or enjoys them, as one continues to experience that sensation, eventually that sensation will shift from the apparent happiness that one evaluates it as being when there's that initial alleviation of the suffering, which is that it's designed to eliminate. But eventually, as one continues to experience that sensation, it will transform into an obvious sensation of suffering. Suffering is not like that. Suffering, in fact, works in a different fashion, where it's as we said in the example earlier, where when one sees a patch of blue, that's you see blue, and whenever you look at blue, you see blue. It's just that you don't see some other color like yellow or something like that. So in that case, that experience of suffering, no matter how long one experiences it, for that duration, it doesn't, by its own nature, transform into its opposite happiness. Whereas contaminated happiness, by its very nature, will eventually, those sensations will eventually transform into their opposite, the sensations of suffering.
Oh yeah. 대나시전에 가왕아주 그 도이 가수당 좋아다 차바다 냐와다 두발라 써와 아니 동아와 르바 차오 세야지 랑신지 대바 매바 아니 가서 랑신지 동아 대바 매바 아니 동아 칠체와라 대와 대면 랑신지 대바 매바 조이 내가라래 아니 냐위 내가라래 두비 내가라래 강이나 집어 직장체.
It says it's the same thing as expressed in the sutra of where it's a sutra called the entrance of Ananda into the womb. And in that sutra, it's explained, the Lord Buddha said that all of the different kinds of sensations that we have from, that is like from when we walk, or when we sit, or when we lie down, all of these the sensations that arise from those events, when we interpret them as being real pleasurable sensations, but we can see that they don't actually, those sensations do not have that nature. They're not happiness by nature, because if we continue in any one of those states, walking, sitting, lying, what have you, eventually we'll come to experience the opposite sensation, or the sensation of suffering from those whatever conduct we're engaged in.
Oh yeah, that and then digi 리시코지 초와대와라자. 다 리시코지 초와라다나. 타냐도 셈기 대와니 두시기 랑신데 아니 랑거 두시기 랑신데 똑바기 아니 가서래 두시기 랑신데 두시기 또변대와 랑장바 채와 코나 사시 삼로 동조기 까지 아니 랑거 좀 두시기 아니 삼로 동조라 때네 대와 랑장바 코나 채와 사지 또변 다위 동아 랑장바 회장 뒤내가라 아니 또바그 dro다위 동아 랑장바 삼로 동조기 왕기 동아 랑장바지 연나양 아니 회장 대와 랑장바 매바 시와체 지당 대와 오늘 간다는 게 대와지 매바 그봐 어디서 시와차오
So then this is explained also with respect to mental pleasure. That is, conventionally, the mental pleasure or mental happiness is of the nature of idea, of ideation. It is only and entirely created as by thought, as actual or genuine happiness. That is, although it is the case that there is genuine suffering, which is also mentally created or mentally, which is constructed by the mind, which is constructed by thought. Although that exists, there's no. One should understand that there's no genuine happiness in the same way. So although there is genuine suffering, which is mentally fabricated, or conceptually or fabricated by thought, one should understand that there's no genuine happiness in the same way.
아니 또배다와 참 이마 티치 대화 테니 텐도 대화 란젠비 퇴매 대화 오늘 하는 집이 이비 퇴매
So the next verse explains this, an exposition of this statement here. And I've changed the translation a little bit. And the first line in particular, I say, since it is the mere alleviation of suffering, or merely conceptually created, all the pleasure in the world is in fact not really pleasure. So the commentary explains the same thing here. That is, the entirety of the world's sensations of pleasure is merely the alleviation of suffering, and it is merely constructed by thought. Therefore, that happiness is in fact not, doesn't have the meaning of genuine happiness, is in fact not genuine happiness.
숨바 샤발니 세간다 돌템바데 체체 다 제바 샤바데라 대화란전 비주체 가바 뭐 가바 대화란전 비주체 가바라 이지 대화란전 비주체 가바 유지 대화란전 비주체 가바 이게베나네 담보 이지 대화란전 비주체 가바니 이지 대화란전 바 유데 택기비 이지 동아 란잔바기 요아데 군장 가르잖아 택게바기 주 아니 왕주 치러와고 왕주 예비시 잖아 그러봐 되게 니 민데 너집이 주테바 태당 오니지 대위 주민데 스타디 란잔세야데 가제 오니지 대바고 주 말해서 가자라 자그디 대화집이 주대반이 장 오니 오늘 하나게 대화집이 좀 해대 제수로도 마상에 쳐. 안주 예매 제수로 참고 말했어요.
랑게 칭이 주바.
오니 대화잖아. 오니 대화는
So then this leads to the explanation of what has just been said, and there's multiple subdivisions of that. First, there's a rejection or negation of a proof that would claim that there is genuine happiness. I'm using the word genuine to translate Rangtsempa here for those who are following the Tibetan. And so there's that first refutation of some supposed proof that there is genuine happiness has two subdivisions showing that, or a negation of proof for genuine mental happiness, mental pleasure, and then a rejection, refutation of proof that there is genuine physical or bodily happiness. The first of these has to do with the mental, supposed proof for genuine mental happiness. And then someone might say, there is genuine mental happiness because there is the cause that generates that, that is Ishvara. Ishvara is like the creator God.
No.
If you say that, then no, that's not the case. Those who accept that as being the cause that generates happiness, those causes that are accepted as the cause of genuine happiness, those are not real causes. They're not causes of happiness that exist by means of their own intrinsic nature. They're not the natural or by nature the causes of happiness, because the relationships among the parts of this statement do not obtain.
No. 他对了，这做是马上会吃是吧？按住月呗，按你一对月吃完没？就是那马上会吃。但马上我开始来啥呢？领导、有党、南党亲，初党、单党、可南党，马上啥东让不到，平面姐姐来噻，这听领导、有党，他这就是么下个多，南党、亲党，初。初党、单党、快党，你讲马家党、山东党、兰博党、大党，平面的就是不那么，就是不那老家家来三把是吧？有党、领党、有党、南党就初党、单党、快南党、马家、山东、兰博党，平面家家来三把是，那对了。看着看了，什么嘛？特意得些差，谁看了？看个菜有就是不太看下，用完了浪街呗，是吧？领导有党南党少，有就是不看下，用完了浪街吧。都年比什么嘛？提一次得些弄不差了，那得些弄不差了，我得看了，看着看了，算就把特意得些差。Yeah.
So then the reason why the different portions of that statement do not obtain, that is, the claim is being made here that there is a genuine cause of genuine mental happiness, because the cause which generates that, that is Ishvara, the creator God, exists. The reason that doesn't, that supposed proof doesn't work is because is demonstrated in what follows. That is, the causes of that generate what is considered mental pleasure do not arise from Ishvara. And the reason is given in the next verse, 49. The continents, a country, a place, a house, a swing, a seat, clothing, a bed, food, drink, an elephant, a horse, and a woman are all enjoyed at distinct points in time. So this lists 13 different things which can be utilized or enjoyed. And so they're listed again here. The continents, like a place or a continent, a region within a continent, a place that one lives within that, a house, a swing, a bed, a clothing, a bed, food, drink, an elephant, a horse, a woman. These are utilized at different points in time.
오야 다 뒤에는 주수보 난게 나네 아니 세당 커다고 다고라 세다고 뭐 커다고 찔라 롱죄진 아니 더 냠비 로충아 티세 아니 상마 일라 미세베 세레 샴바그 주수보 나네 상마 일라 미세베 티세 상마 남지 텐도 란잔비 대위 주 테메바레 상마 나람 란잔지 주 테메데 주수봉 되면봐 니데 주수봉이 원이지 대위 주의나 주수보대 원이죠 뭐이 엄마 라신지 대위 주의나 아니 롱 맞아지 맞아 비쳐야 안에 대화기와 그래 맞아 비쳐나야 대화기와 그러나 대매비치당 야
So the next verse then explains this further, that it says, one has pleasure, quote unquote, through whichever of these the mind attends to, but one does not attend to the rest or pay attention to the rest. Hence they are not, and then I'm saying in fact, causes of pleasure. So then the commentary elaborates on this, saying that at the time when you take any one of these things and utilize them or experience them, use them, enjoy them, and you give, and your mind, there appears in your mind the idea, this is pleasure. Whenever that arises, then at that time, one falsely assumes that produced that pleasure occurred due to that. One has that false assumption, and when one is enjoying one of these things, and at the time that one has the idea, this is pleasure. Then at that time, one is not paying attention to the remaining things. And so at that time, during that time, the remaining things, in fact, are not are meaningless in the sense of being the genuine, the causes of genuine pleasure.
그래서 아마 일라 미세베 아니 대전 하마나 텐도란 잠비 대위 주 테메 봐 인상 대제 텐도 대예매 되면이 세 대매세도 자와 전체 주수봉 원지 되 주이나 롬 마제지 마제비체양 대와 제와 르나 아니 롬 마제진 마제비체는 대와 제와 매비치나 유지라 론제비지 하마라 론제바 요 말이 세고네 말아서 매비체 매와다 아니 유디 여바잠지야 대위 주조고 말이 유다 유제 차고를 말도 대와 정제로와 유 여바잠지장 대위 주 민주로.
So then, if all 13 of these were by their nature, by their intrinsic nature, the causes of happiness, then when one is not enjoying them, even when one is not recalling them, they would necessarily, or it would be proper for them to give rise to pleasure. And because that is not the case, at the time that one is experiencing, at the time one is enjoying one of these objects, and because it's the case that one is not enjoying the other objects, those objects, the simple existence of those objects is not sufficient. Is not sufficient to be the causes of happiness.
Oh yeah. 다 뒤제라 리지대와 한잔비 주체 가봐. 자. 양 원이지려. 용한 뉴와티 주체 임바 가바탕. 수자 치로 르장아티 용한 뉴와 주체 임바다. 레르 주체 임바 가바. 이 예배나니. 다 담보 용한 안에 뉴와 주체 임바 가바텔라. 파로비 용아이 대와 뒤지도 용그래. 수자 치로 르장아라 미비 대와 뒤지도 용그래. 간르레사나 아니 내가 차비잖아 내가 수당 내가 림비 자당 뒤에 아니 아가리 치당 장지 로당 거지 리자 안봉의 냠수 아니 용 초그래 스테이지도 sana.
So then this next comes the refutation of a supposed proof that there is genuine physical pleasure, bodily pleasure. And this is broken into two parts. First, a refutation that the collection of the five sensory objects together functions as that which produces that pleasure, and then showing that the refutation that each of them individually is that which produces that kind of physical or bodily pleasure. So first comes the refutation of the five sensory objects in a composite form, being that which actualizes bodily pleasure. And here someone might put forth the idea that that one experiences the pleasure of the five sense objects at a single time. We have that experience. So, for example, if you take a dramatic performer, there's someone who's performing a dramatic performance. Their visible form, the visible form of the actor. Then there's the sound of the lute that they're playing, the vina that they're playing. There's scent from aloe wood that one is smelling. There's the taste of honey that one can be experiencing. And then there's the texture of clothes, the cloth. So all five of these sense objects can then be experienced by the five sense faculties. So if you're to say that,
다 되라. 밀라서요 안봉에 용아 진짜 강기칠. 세가 밀라서 미가 안보나야 안보네 안보라서 안봉아와기 유수자트 리자라서 용아 전바 티체나 티 대왕아 뒤지도와 말에 대왕아 뒤지도 매바 가르래서나 진짜 강기치나 대왕 용아들라 또배 마숭나 내가 미시바 강시스 대왕 용아들 또배 마숭나 대왕 시와 미시와 강시 아니 용아단 대왕알라 뒤지도 안에 또바쳐봐요 말에 암시티
Then verse 51 explains, the five sense faculties such as the eye do not conceptualize, do not apprehend is better, the five kinds of object, or do not conceptualize, that's okay, sorry. Do not conceptualize the five kinds of objects that they apprehend. Therefore, at that time, one does not perceive them as pleasant. So here the five sense faculties are the eye, ear, nose, tongue, body, the five. And then the five objects are visible forms, sounds, sense, taste, tastes, and then textures. So at the time that the five sense faculties are apprehending the five objects, then the five sorts of pleasure or happiness of those five sensory experiences do not exist at the same time. Why? Because when they are not apprehended by thought, they're not known as pleasure, as happiness. And the five objects and the five forms of happiness are not conceptualized simultaneously at a single time.
Oh yeah, that didn't. Can't you need can't ambo can't see jurba. Sena, you Sudan Dala Sova. Ani ambo mega ambo dan I ambo la sova. You can't ambo ambishewa can't kangi. Ani shewa chua ti. Ani oh ambo hame you hama. Zimbatam. Ambo hame yu haman zimatam. Tela givi dewa yuwa maris. Ambo hama ki yu haman. Ambo hama tedaki yu haman tila drola so mizimbatam. 텔라기바기야 대화요 마디 묘 가르레 준자 가르레 대제 유하만은 안음 대위 턴도 매봐 대위 턴도 요 말했어 아사디기 유 대위 턴도 요 말해 이 로티기 대위 턴도 매봐 이 치로서
Then this is further explained in the next verse. When one is aware of one of the 5 kinds of objects by means of one of the senses, one has no awareness of the remaining kinds of objects by means of the remaining senses, because those remaining objects are not taken as objects at that time. So at the time at which there's a particular object, such as visible forms and so forth, this includes also sounds, smells, the tastes, etc., and all of those things. And then when those are recognized or known by their specific sense faculties, that is, the eye is the specific sense faculty that is aware of visible forms, the ear is the specific sense faculty that is aware of sounds, and so forth, then at that time, the remaining sense faculties, the remainder of them, do not apprehend the remaining sense objects. And therefore, there's no pleasure or happiness which is generated, which arises with respect to that is, with respect to those objects, since the other sense faculties are not apprehending their objects in that way, there's no happiness that with respect to that. And because at that time, at that particular time, the remaining objects do not exist as any objects of happiness. That is, they don't exist such that they function as objects of pleasure or happiness at that time. For that person, that is, an individual person cognizes these objects sequentially, not simultaneously.
Oh yeah. 다디 준전데 유하마 데위튼도 매반디 준전데 마송고 있어라. 안보이니 미주바 대외 유지 남발라스. 다순지 안보기 유 아니 미기시와 안보 미시기 유 아니 수라 소와라. 안보이니 유 미바 추아나. 란두나 네비 안보티기 있어. 안보티기 란두나 네비 유지 남바 수텔라. 아니 수대라 미네 도벤 디수소 냠베 아니 도 냠바 로바이라스 도벤 도바는 도 냠도 로바이라스 다텔라 수텔레 셴바기 아니 자단 치단 로라 소와라 아니 가서레 도 냠바기 도바게요 말에 민자 가르레서나 도바 투마 뒤지도 지금 말이스 그와 넘바 쳐봐이라 뒤지라 도바 투마 직자리 지금 말이스
So verse 53 says, and I've changed perceive into observe in this. The mind observes the image of an object that was observed in the past by the sense faculties. Observing it, the mind conceptualizes the image and assumes it to be pleasant. I changed believes into assumes also. What was stated above in the previous verse is necessarily the case for the reason that's given in this verse here. That is, when a sense faculty observes its specific sense object, then and at that time it produces a specific image or aspect of the object which is existing at that particular time that it's being observed by the sense faculty. And then that aspect or image is what is observed by the mind, by the mental awareness. So the mental awareness, having observed that aspect of the object, it comes to think, and first it observes it observes that aspect of the sense object, and then it comes to falsely assume this is pleasure. This is pleasure. So it thinks that, and also within a single continuity of cognition, within a single stream of cognition, it's not the case that multiple forms of thought occur simultaneously or arise simultaneously.
Oh, yeah. That didn't 가서 그래. 유가레레 주제 힘바 가발라. 뭐단 주제 니 예배나네. 담보니 디나 안보 찍으니 전식 시바 강인바. 是吧? 직된디나 안에 미가 안보다고 찍이 유수다고 그 전식 시바 강인바 탕. 디나 안보 찍으니 전식 시바 강인바. 대양 수라 마대바 미왕기 아니 마대바 미가 안보기 수시와야 매바. 자, 아니 미왕텔라 마대바야 아니야 수야 매바. 수지 대매바 미왕기 대매라. 수지 대양 미왕데 매바 매배 편지되주래. 라 수지 미왕라테 미왕대양 수라테 편지되바 인장 원이지와 말했으라. 라왕 원이지와 말해. 원이지면은 대매바 인장 류지대와 란산바양 원이지대와 지와 말해.
So then next comes a refutation that the individual five sense objects, the five sense objects individually function to produce genuine happiness. This has the actual statement of the refutation, and then a further refutation of the proof that would be given in support of the wrong view here. So first comes the actual refutation itself. This is in verse 54. A single sense faculty knows a single kind of object, but without that object, it is not really a sense faculty. And without that sense faculty, the object is not really an object. The commentary explains this further. Here in the world, if you take a single sense faculty, such as the eye, then it is the awareness for which there's a specific one kind of object, which is in this case visible form. So each of the sense faculties has its own specific object. Visible forms for vision, sounds for hearing, and so forth. And then that being the case, if there's no visible form, or Zukidun mepar, Zukidun mepar, Zukidun mepar.
수지 대매바 미가 안보야 매바.
So if there's no object in the sense of the visible form, then there's also there's no vision, there's no eye faculty in fact either, and and then likewise with respect to the object
수다 안보니오데 편지 떼봐 인상 명한테 매바 대매배 편지 떼 위치 원이지 좋아요 말에 뭐지
So since, and with respect to the visible form as an object also, it doesn't exist without that, as an object, without that the vision itself, the faculty of seeing, of vision, and therefore it would be meaningless without its particular. It would be meaningless as an object without its particular sense faculty, in this case, the eye organ or the faculty of seeing. And because that is the case, because of the meaninglessness of the object without its organ or faculty, and the meaninglessness of the sense itself, the sense faculty, without its particular objects. They are mutually contingent. They are mutually contingent. And since they don't exist by intrinsic nature, and because that is the case, that there's an absence of any kind of intrinsic nature of these things, therefore,
원이지 매바도 류지 대화 안잡아 요 말에. 당신지 대화 요 말에서.
So the absence of that kind of existing by means of its own intrinsic nature entails the absence or the non-existence of some kind of genuine physical pleasure or physical happiness as well.
다 두제 가봐대라. 남세랑신지 주와 가봐. 유랑신지 주와 가봐. 안보랑신지 주와 가봐. 소음 예배 나네. 남세랑신지 주와 가봐대라. 아니 유다 안보 가서래. 유다 안보 랑근 예대. 아니 유왕이기 대부 남세대 요아레스. 요와 인자랑신지 요고레스 해대라. 치다마다 파타라. 때내 분이 중시해봐 세대 배려체 대신 미당 수대는 남시 남바시와 중화세 세대기 답배이 가서 치다 파다 마다라 때내 아니 부중화세봐 대신투 아니 안보 밀당 유수라 때내 아니 남시 중화세배 안 남시랑 남시 중화세봐 남바시와 라시지 메데스 중앙 셰베 나바셔바 라신지 요 말레스 미다술라 데위체르 다 대송 거래 만이야 주의가나 남시 요한 남시 요한 남 안보당 술라 때는 아니 남시 제와 인장 란전 요아레 저 다 대매위 주전데라 아니 미다술라 때는 나바셔바 라신지 메데 묘한데 술라 데와레 배만 배나 파마다 부신 부대 팔아 파마라 되어래. 대주인자 원이요 말했어. 안전요 말했어.
So then it comes a refutation of the idea that consciousness is established by means of its own intrinsic nature. And here someone might come and say, well, these objects and the faculties that know them or that cognize them exist by means of their own character, because we know that the result of them, that is consciousness, exists. So the person will put forth that kind of claim. They're trying to establish that the objects, the organs that cognize them, or faculties that cognize them, as well as the consciousness that is aware of them, is established by means of its own intrinsic nature. So the refutation of that is given in the next verse, 55, which says, just as a child comes into existence in dependence upon its parents, so too awareness is said to arise in dependence upon the eye and a visible form. So just as in dependence upon a father and a mother, a child arises, it's explained in that way. Then, just like that, in dependence upon the eye organ, as well as a visible form, then the consciousness that knows that visible form arises, and therefore, because that's the case, that consciousness doesn't exist by means of its own intrinsic nature. It's non-existent by means of its own intrinsic nature, because it is contingent upon the eye and the visible form. And so just as in the example that's been given, just like parents and children, they are the eye and the eye and the visible form are that which gives rise to the awareness of the visible form. Therefore, they're contingent upon each other. That is, without the eye and the visible form, the consciousness does not exist.
Oh yeah. That day wala zi tenda kondu sheba ge ka so re. Chita pada mata la tenen puni chunga ta chita mida namba shewa chunga she di loben dawa chapa ge tsisa do chamba la.
Again, die Dindogi Dinsik.
Ah.
Dindogi Dinsik.
Ah.
Die Dindogi Dinsik.
Oh tenda wa de tenda ge tenzi res. 是吧？让心里面就除了对不起，对住等这个等这个。
So this is a reasoning based on dependent origination in the sense of contingency. That is, things that are contingent upon each other. One establishes their lack of intrinsic nature by this dependent relationship.
Oh yeah, 那第七节的主杀级下节下把情感忙不过，咋把写那个七节的。 人生的处度呗，这我这些推荐，那这些的推荐家长习惯，安尼开办东西，这把太当，搞个都是特别忙要顾的，是太怎么去？
So this verse here out of the precious Garland, Master Chandrakirti has quoted this in his Clear Words commentary, and many people who are in the process of or explain the meaning of there's another commentary of Master Chandrakirti called the Pradipa Jyotana, or the clear lamp. They think that they make the mistake that this is one of the root verses in the basic wisdom of Master Nagarjuna. And if that was the case, that's a mistake, though, because if that was the case, then it would contradict the position that's held by many of the Indian scholars, that there are 449 verses in the basic wisdom.
他今天接的了，有让心去做干巴呢，那么些让心去约的体有啊，有为切身啊。 有你带到马蛋的，安不接的，安不堂姐推你来，听你他的，听你来的没提起，看到他这样的没是，我在第四上，有带我当马我把那些当接我，嘎巴当马多比起日子呢，马多比起日，带马我听你来呢，马带外是带我当马我你来马带外。 让心里面把的他打我的，让心里面把他打的，连毛问句推呢没呢，俺那听你了没得我他，让心里面把他打我的，连毛问，他打我的连毛问推呢没呢，听你了连毛问你了没得我他，对不起，听你一推呢要过过来，是吧？他的呢？ 他打我当连毛问你来他的都出啊没被吃的，他打我的连毛问你来他的都出啊没被吃的，俺不让叫我推没了，看他打与推没呗，那些让自己出啊没多，是吧？对呀。
So the next explains how it is there's a refutation of the objects existing by means of their own intrinsic nature. The hypothetical or actual opponent here might say, well, consciousness exists by means of its own intrinsic nature because its objects exist. And then the response to that is given in verse 56. And here and henceforth, I'm translating what they give as unreal instead as meaningless. So I say past and future objects are meaningless, and so are past and future faculties. Present ones are not distinct from those two past and future ones. Hence, the present ones are also meaningless. So the commentary on this explains that here the objects, objects which existed in the past, objects that exist in the future, together with the consciousness that the awareness of them has either ceased or it has not yet been obtained. It does not yet exist. And since there is no other category beyond the past and the future that those two could exist in, then this current thing, which is devoid of intrinsic nature, since it would not exist during the time of the past or the future, it would obtain that it would not be dependent upon those two, the past and the future. And then if you come back and you say, well, it is contingent upon those two, then it would necessarily be the case that consciousness or that object would exist during those two times, that is in the past and in the future.
Oh yeah. 단 남시 타다와 그 유 타다와 전배 안보다 되니 라시 유아래. 다제 안보다 메유 수니오데 라시 유고래. 요 가르에서 남시 타다와 그 유 아니 남시 타다와 유 타다와 전기도 와스나 전배 여도스나 지다 미니 추와의 감미 콜로 전제바 대신 안보 남진이 다지 유다 전바체 세가나
La gene gymason di tubechu deniki duna yup ngi gymason di tubechu deniki duna yupartal duna dantawa de maon nila tari duba mebechu
对于是对对于되니지 되냐 요거래스 되나 다다와다 마옹바니라 타대도 추와 메비치나 안보단 제와 템메라스 강 다다위 태야 메베 나시람 시지 추와 메도.
So then the end of that is saying that, so the opponent here would come back and say, well, it is the case that they are contingent upon the past and the future. And then if they accept that, then it would necessarily be the case that the consciousness and the object that it's cognizing, as well as the organ that it's based upon, would necessarily exist during those times in the past and in the future. Then if you accept that, then this current consciousness and so forth, since there's no way to since there's no way to
얘나 다다와단 대마원이 일에 타대도 추와 메비치 다다와 대마원이라 타대도 추와 메비치 안보단 제위 되면라. 봐. 강 다다위 되면베 남시랑시 추와 메도.
So then if you accept that, or if you hold that position, you would have to say that the present form of that awareness, as well as the object and the organ that's generating the awareness, since it would be impossible to establish those apart from the past and the future, then the organs that give rise to that awareness would become meaningless, because they would be completely pointless or meaningless. Because and that which is meaningless even in the present cannot serve as something that is going to be able to establish consciousness as existing by means of its own intrinsic nature.
Oh yeah, 단 남시 다다와 유 다다와 때문에 안보다 되니 라시주나 예스나 지다 미니 추와네 감미 코로 진제바 대신 안보 남제니 다대 유다 전바 제시가나 지다 미 추와이 아니 감미 코로 전바 대신 안보 남제자 다다위 유 전바 셔바 인지 안보다 유다 나바시와 강양 아니 라시지 추와요 말이 아니 가르에서 로 추와라 나라시지 추와도 로 추와라 나와도 세바래.
So then the opponent might come back and say, well, this present consciousness apprehends a present object. And therefore, Therefore the organ and the object both exist by means of their own intrinsic nature. The reply to that is given in verse 57. The eye erroneously apprehends the circle formed by a torch being whirled around. Likewise, the sense faculties apprehend objects as if they were present. So the example is explained first. Just as the eye, due to an error by an error of vision, misapprehends as a wheel that which is a torch which is spinning around. Similarly, the sense faculties apprehend current objects. But is nevertheless the case that those sense faculties, the objects, and the consciousness, none among them at all exists by means of its own intrinsic nature, because they are nothing but the mere appearance of something, mere appearances that appear to a erroneous cognition.
Oh yeah, that didn't match. Ambo rashi ji chua kaba la, junga rashi ji chua kabe, ane ambo de te rashi chua kaba. Junga rashi ji chua kaba da, tena su rashi ji chua chuba o sene. Da sum ginane, junga rashi ji chua kaba, wande rashi ji chua kaba tela. Da wande rashi ji yeba di gunzan kare re sana, wambo da ten, ti ju junga shi yebi chir sena.
So then next comes the refutation that the faculties themselves, the sense faculties, are established by means of intrinsic nature. This has three parts. First, a refutation that the objects of the sense faculties exist by means of their own intrinsic nature. And this is achieved, this refutation is achieved by refuting the notion that the elements, material elements, are established by means of their intrinsic nature. And then second comes a refutation of the elements themselves as being established by means of their intrinsic nature. And then finally, due to that, showing that visible forms are not established by means of their own intrinsic nature. So first comes the refutation of the sense objects as existing by means of their own intrinsic nature through refuting the elements that compose them as being established by means of intrinsic nature. The opponent here comes back and says that the objects of the sense objects exist by means of their intrinsic nature. Because the causes of these, that is, the material elements, exist.
Oh, yeah. That's all. Ambo rashi chua kaba tira, da ambo junga rashi chua kaba, ando rashi chua kaba. Da junga rashi chua kaba, tel ke bangche tengurwa. Du rashi chua kaba. Da junga rashi chua, ando rashi chua kaba tela, ando rashi yuye de ti junga yuwe chirsena. Ambo namda ando na junga namji rashi de sega, ando teta tendo rashi ji ten, rashi ji ten yo amare. Mewa kare resa. Ambo namdang, ani wande nam, wande sena tuen sena suso tuanga. Junga namji devi rashin du dena, junga shi duwa da sosi rashin du chubi ten medo. Junga namji devi rashin du dena, ani junga shi duwa da sosi rashin du chubi ten me, rashin du chubi ten yamare.
So then the next verse says, the sense faculties and the sense objects are accepted, I changed the translation there too, are accepted as composed of the five elements. But since the elements are meaningless individually, they are also meaningless in fact. I've changed the translation there a little bit. The last two lines again. But since the elements are meaningless individually, they are also meaningless in fact. So here then it says, with respect to these objects of the senses, in fact, that is, or in fact, or they don't exist in the sense of being of having intrinsic nature. They don't have any intrinsic nature. The since it's accepted that, if you take the sense faculties and the objects of the senses, and if you hold them as if they existed intrinsically as the results of the elements, then
안되남 과 반전되다 전도 라신지 돼요 말해서 라신지 돼매도 안보남다 안되나 중앙남지 대비 라신도 되나 세대 중앙 소속의 라신 매사비 라신 추시비 라신 아니 가소래 아니 사 따라랑 그 라신 좋아라 오 대초바 두발에 되나 아니 중앙시 소소와다 라신이 주의돼요 말해.
So regarding these, the sense faculties themselves, as well as the objects of the sense faculties, the sense objects, if you hold that they have a nature as being the result of the elements, this is referring then to the specific elements of earth, water, fire, and so forth, each of which has its own specific nature. That is the nature of earth, or the nature of earth is solidity. The nature of water is kind of cohesiveness, and the nature of fire is heat, and so forth. If you accept that these the sense faculties and the sense objects have the nature of being the results of the elements, then we would say that they're meaningless in the sense of they're meaningless in the sense of being established by means of their own intrinsic nature, either as the collection of the four elements or as the eating of the four elements individually.
어야 다더니 중화라시 주와 가봐도 중놈 소소 타대나 비신 매바 메탈주 뉘나 천이 매도데 나마양 대당에 중놈 소소 타대나 하사나 사사주 명기 중화 대다 중화남 소소를 다 때문에 바타대도이나 판지찌라 지금 마대바 타대바 예나 아니 비신 매바기 메타월 주 그래 그 비신 매바나 메타월 주 메고래 아 비신 매바 메타월 주디 소소 때문에 예나 메생간데 아니 가소래 비신을 때네 좀 메고봐 이러와 근데 좀 뭐가 비신 매기 메타월 주라 다 중화 때문에 많이 봐 아니 뒤나 중화 소소소소소소 천이 메사 중화 소소기 차와당 련라 엠비라신라 소와 뒤나 소소 천이 라시요 말에 라시지 매바 되는效果 인자 소소 천이 라시지 매바 주대 되위치 어다디 중화 하마 숨라야 냐와 대단 제체
So then next is explained a refutation of the elements themselves being established by means of intrinsic nature. And this is verse 59. So this says, if the elements were distinct from each other, then fire could occur without fuel. But if they form a single composite, then they have no, and I've changed the translation to specific identity. Then they have no specific identity. This analysis applies to the remaining elements. So the commentary here says that if the elements existed individually such that they were not contingent and that they were able to exist separately, then it would obtain, or it would be the case, that you would have fire without firewood. That is, it would be the case that one would be able to point to fire in the absence of any kind of fuel that gives rise to fire. So that's unacceptable. And if you hold, on the other hand, that there's a composite of them existing in that way, in a non-contingent fashion, then, or rather, if you collect them together, then that their individual identity also would not exist by means of its own intrinsic nature. They're
그래서 리나 생이 매도지 라마라야 대단한 게 리나 아세나 주마 소소 뒤바 아니 소소 생이 뒤밤 소소 강가对住 현장 아니 라신지 생이 라신지 매바 주대 편지 되위치.
So then, on the other hand, if you collect them together in that way, then their individual specific identities would also be not established, not exist by means of intrinsic nature, because they are contingent. They are contingent upon each other. And this applies also to the remaining three great elements as well. The same kind of fault would obtain with each of them individually as well, and collectively in that same way. It's ascertained like that.
야, 다 되네. 주라시지 맞추봐라. 대다 주남 이수왕 개매반에 뒤대매 세가나 대다 주완남 소소당 류완이가 차세 류완이 이수왕 라시지 투비 되매배나 대다 주남 이수왕 라시 되매바나 류완이장 중화 소소 류완이장 라시지 투비 되매 Yeah.
So then, furthermore, in both these ways, the elements are meaningless. So a composite form from them is also meaningless. This says that, thus, if you take the elements individually or collectively, in either way, they're meaningless in the sense of existing or being established by means of their own intrinsic nature. And therefore, since that is the case, as a composite as well, they're meaningless in the sense of being established by means of their own intrinsic nature.
Duwa teme nyeji ji sujan tendum teme do se gala duwa teme ba nyeji chil ani da sujan tendu de rashin ji jube tenya mare se teme be ani luji dewa ranzam be ju o nyeji ani ranzam dewa je ge ani ju ya mare se
Die zoek die
수장 라신지 주에 되어 말해
숙디 그래서 퐁퐁에 숙 여러 숙
중시 뒤에 그
중시 뒤에 Okay, so then second half of verse 60 says, and since a composite is meaningless, then visible form is also meaningless in fact. So therefore, since, and the commentary says much the same thing, saying that because of the meaninglessness of a composite of the elements, because that would be meaningless, then likewise a visible form is in fact meaningless in the sense of being established by means of its own intrinsic nature. And since that is non-existent, the visible form and so forth being established by means of their own intrinsic nature, then there's also, they cannot serve, they do not exist as the cause of genuine physical pleasure.
오예 대매반 예지지 아니 중시 소유장 전도대 라신지 주와 매어 말에 중화시야 난 류지 대화란 점지 다 되네 대화란 점지 뭐 가봐대라 초와당 남시당 누시당 차초소 대자 현지도 뒤에 중화인장 라신지 요아래 라나 남시 초당 누시당 누시 남장 탐제도 소소단이 된매체 담비 텐도 된매도 세가나 아니 가르쳐 그래서나 대비 초한 대화 대비 초와 대한다바 라시지 주에 대화 말에 대매와 가르래서나 남시지 분보다 초유 분보 두시지 분보 두시 남장 탐제 뒤와대 라시지 마주치 소소량 양다반지 뒤와 마인바 레레나야 아니 양다바 주베 태요 말에 소소단이 태매제 담비 남시 초당 뇌시당 뇌제 남자 탐제도 소소단이 태매체 뒤와요 됐어요다 뇌제나 탐제 뒤와야 라시지 마주 소소양 라시 아니 라시 주베 다니도 마주바래
So then, consciousness, sensation, ideation, and activities in no way have any ultimate essence. Therefore, they are ultimately meaningless. I've changed some of the translation terminology there. So here, the opponent might say, well, sensation, consciousness, ideation, activities, and arise together, or rather, I'm sorry, let me start over with that. Here, this topic here is the refutation that that there's a actual character, a genuine character of happiness or pleasure. So the opponent says here that sensation, such as pleasurable sensations, exist by means of their own intrinsic nature because they arise together with consciousness, ideation, and activities. So the sensations arise in conjunction or together with those. So the reply to that is that that consciousness, sensation, ideation, activities as well, entirely are meaningless individually, as having individual sort of self-nature, and they're meaningless from the ultimate point of view as well. So the commentary on this says that the pleasurable sensation ultimately is meaningless in the sense of being established by means of its own intrinsic nature. That the aggregate of consciousness, the aggregate of sensation, of ideation, of activities, is entirely, or entirely and collectively, if you take them all together, are not established by means of intrinsic nature. And likewise, with regard to them individually, they're meaningless in the sense of being established by means of their own entity or by means of themselves.
yeah, 다니와 동아라시지 주와 가바텔라. 차바 세비 요 대화 란젠바 오 두제다 자와 가네. 아니 가서 자바 세비 요 동아지라시지 주와 고바 이노 세. 다텔라. 가서로 기타 동아 취재라 전도 대화랑 아자체 다 다중 얘기 전부 나신 이전에 기타 동아 칠체의 초와 동아 슉 중세 충이남 동아 중세 슉 충이 내가라 전도 안에 다란데 대화지 아니 이거마라 아자체 바티신도 좋아 기타 동아 취재라 대위 전도 아자체 야 안돼 봐줘다
ngaja di kari
ngala 대화 충성은 양밖에 가자
So then next comes a refutation of the idea that suffering exists or is established by means of its own intrinsic nature. So here then, there's this refutation here is the refutation of the idea that suffering exists by means of its own intrinsic nature in three different ways. The first of these would be that that the treparsipi yu dewa rangsampa ngotang rupse
쭉 갑라. 전도 란잠비 대와 가자 쳐봐. 가봐세요. 쳐봐서 그 요다 요 쳐봐서 그 쳐네 안에 써봐게 요.
So here then, this is a refutation that the suffering which arises due to separation, or I'm sorry, I'm getting tangled up here. This is a refutation of the idea that the suffering, which is a craving to be separated from something, exists by means of its own intrinsic nature. So here then, this has multiple portions to it. There's, first of all, the refutation that that there's 대와 랑심파 ngōdāng drupche.
ngōdāng drāwar sepa, dewādāng mindrāwar sepa sikirwa.
Di drepersipi,
ngōdāng drāwar sepa, ngōdāng
drepersipi yu dewa rangsimpa.
dewa rangsimpa ngō drupche da jawa kāne.
Chepa kagne. Drāwar sipi yu dunga.
Drāwar sepa.
Drāwar sipi yu.
ngōdāng drāwar sepa.
Dunga rangshingi drupa kopa.
Sepi yu, dunga rangzanji drupa kopa yinsi.
Okay. So, with respect to this refutation that suffering exists or is established by means of its own intrinsic nature, by rejecting the idea that that the desire to be, I'm sorry, I'm really getting tangled up in the syntax of this introduction here. Re inedi kasagodi treparsipi yu dewa ransampa ngō dan drupche dan chepa kakne.
ngō drupche dan jawa kāne. Drāwar kāne, drāwar sepi yu yinpa dunga jirāng shingōpa. Drāwar sepa. Drāwar sepi yu yinpa dunga rāng shingī chua kōpa.
Okay, by negating the idea that that there's genuine happiness which comes about from coming into contact with a object of craving, together with the general character of that, and that coming into contact with that object functions so as to produce that kind of happiness. By negating that, then one is able to negate that the suffering which comes about from objects which one desires, which one craves to be separated from, exists by means of its own intrinsic nature. And then this leads into the next verse. So this is the introduction to verse 62. And I retranslated this entirely, so I'm just going to read my translation of it. Just as conceit in happiness is in fact the alleviation of suffering, so conceit in suffering is born from the prevention of happiness.
그래서 지다 동아 취제라 대비 텐도 가자체 지다 동아 취취바 차와 동아 중세 숙초비 내가라 텐도 란잠비 대와 란잠바야 가자체바 대신 대좀 중앙라 동아 통양 아자체 어디네 대화 점심 대화 온주와 중세 아니 매바 중화라 아라시지 주비 동아 통양 아니 아자체 바세지 라시지 주비 동아 중세장 매대 아니 간지 때로 담세 때제 담세 세베체
So the first part of this is explained in the commentary by saying that just as the alleviation of suffering, this is referring basically just to certain situations in which one's suffering has diminished somewhat in its force. In fact, or rather, we sort of have a kind of arrogance or conceit that this is genuine happiness. We imagine that this is in fact happiness or is genuine happiness. Just like that, when on an occasion when our happiness is destroyed and it disappears to some extent, when that occurs, then we also come to think and we develop the conceit that this is suffering which is established by means of its own intrinsic nature. However, that suffering which is established by means of its own intrinsic nature doesn't exist to any extent at all, because it is simply these things are simply contingent phenomena. They're simply contingent phenomena that they depend upon each other.
오야 다티니 대연제기 안에 소와당 중화 오 풍봉알라서 와라시 주바 까베 다 제부되라 아니 라시지메 바 메비 돈이 또베 초와때바다 돈이 또베 유전 그 롱어서와 니 예베 나네 담보 돈이 또베 초와때바나 대당 오 님이 칠 대당 채비 세바당 동아당 자비 세바봉 대지 대다 통화 초서 나를 세바기 아니 차바게 세바 유단제와 오니지 주와 매비체를 라신지 주와 오니지 주와 매비체를 아 라신지 돈베 태양 공부할래 세요 대단 제비 세바 세디마라 라신지 주비 돈베 태양 공부라 초와 대화단 제비 세바 초와 대화라 민자와 세비 세바 초와 동아라 자비 세바 민자비 세바당 아니 초와 동아단 자비 세바 봉라 동아 미 대단 체비 세바당 동아 자비 세바 봉 세바 봉에 빵발레 아니 다레 주제기 레 미소바 그래서 주제기 레다 편제기 레 니가 못 써봐 세바 봉에 레 미소징 렘미소 바인자 레지 대부 사천일리지 풍부 주변 매바인자 코알레 초와 유비 유아 티칠 대중 주위 타탐제단 차와 통화레 아니 초와 주베스 오 코알레 초와 주베 돈이지 된도발라 배바차고 그래
So then the fruit of all of these refutations, the refutations that have been done above, showing that there's no intrinsically existing happiness, there's no intrinsically existing suffering, that these sensations of happiness and suffering are contingent upon the organs, the consciousness that's experiencing it, the objects, and that all of these different components that produce these sensations of pleasure and pain and so forth are themselves contingent in that they're dependent upon various external factors. So the result of that analysis and refutation is given in two parts. First, showing the exposition that shows that by understanding emptiness, one is liberated, and then an identification of the cognition, which is the cognition which the cognition which is the consciousness which ascertains or understands emptiness. So first comes the exposition that through understanding emptiness, one is liberated. And this is in verse 63. Since they are essenceless, one eliminates the craving to obtain pleasure and the craving to avoid pain. Those who see them thus attain liberation thereby. So this then is explained in the commentary. It says, as previously explained, craving together with its objects are, since they are without any kind of existence which is established by means of essence or intrinsically, then by meditating, cultivating and conditioning oneself to the object here, which is the absence of intrinsic nature, by means of that, then one is able to get rid of craving for pleasurable sensation together with, or rather, one is able to get rid of the craving which desires to connect with pleasurable sensations. And likewise, one is able to get rid of the craving, which is the desire to become separated from suffering in that way. And by getting rid of craving, one no longer will accumulate karma. One will no longer create and accumulate karma. And then one will be liberated from samsara. And because that is the case, therefore, because one will be liberated by seeing dependent origination, which is separated from all of the extremes of the conceptual elaborations, one should make effort to understanding the meaning of emptiness.
Oh, yeah, that dig. Don't you turn to Bala Baba Chow? That did Jella, don't you do you send you learn soon? That young Casa, Gaya Tonga Mebani, Telkana, you Tonga, saying, Madon, you Tonga Tambo, say Gana, Tonga Mebatin, you Tonga, Telkana, you Tonga, Yin Sumanasi, Tonga was here. 大年下把怎么样呢？积极条款呢？你通行呐，是吧？拍拍年下呢，当年是比一些的对些的对吧？多把麻烦呢是，但拍拍年下一些个，拍拍年下呢，当年都比一些的对些的对吧？多把麻烦呢。白白年下呢，年下给那个是当年都比一些几对些几对吧，老把马完呢，马日白老白，马日白老白，老白日白咱们老把马完，安尼亲戚落个路堂，我说啊，没得结巴呗，起码三呢，三江三把对把大，估得全部写完瞧我，是吧？我说哦。
So then next is the identification of the cognition, which is the cognizing subject that understands emptiness. Some might imagine, or someone might say, that since it is said that not seeing anything at all is seeing reality, so they hear that statement. There's statements in the sutra where it says, not seeing is the best seeing. And they misconstrue that as meaning that it's not seeing anything at all. So these people, then they imagine that when they hear that, that not seeing anything at all is the vision of reality. And then, isn't that the case, they say, that it's established like that one has to posit this vision of seeing reality as the not seeing of anything whatsoever. Then they think that, why isn't it the case that one should say, why should one say, see reality? What's the point of saying that there is such a thing as seeing reality? So the answer to that is then given in the next section, where it says that within the meditative equipoise of the Arya, the gnosis which understands emptiness these people would say is not even included within created things. It's not concluded within the, or they would say you would divorce that from the category of things which are created, and people who say things like that are advocating a perverse kind of system. That is, they're saying that, they would say that, for example, that through the elimination of ignorance, you would also eliminate knowledge. That kind of position would be advocated like that. And persons who are advocating that perverse sort of system are just like the Mimamsakas. This is a Tirtaka tradition of Mimamsa, which says that if one eliminates all of the defilements, then the mind as well is completely extinguished. That's their position. And then thus it is a great kind of underestimation or deprecation of the nature of things, and one should understand it as like that.
Oh yeah, that is. 돈이 또 유전이 농어에 송화되라. 강기 샘동 출신나 되니 탄에 돈이 줘봐차. 워낙 강기 아니 통한 주세나, 是吧? 전담대바 통위 샘장 전담대 대바 좋아요. 전담대바 통위 샘 냠샤 가서를 냠샤기 이시대 전담대바 좋아 말해. 탄에도니 전담대바라. 전담대 대바라. 아니 다 가서를 샘대 탄에도야 전담대 대바라. 이나 니비 수지 냠바샤비 로까지 그 제가지 탄에도 전담대바라 냠바샤비 로데 아니 깨지 그 제가 쳐봐티 아니 되게 아니 전단대바 통화래 전단대바 통화 줘봐대 강기 샘동 주시나 탄에 돈이 줘봐대 세로 통화 줘봐대 야.
So the explanation then further, then there's an actual identification here of the subject, which is the cognition that understands emptiness, here referring to that above. Then it's given in verse 64, but who does this seeing? Conventionally, the mind is said to do so, but without mental functions, there is no mind. Since the mind is unreal, or I would say meaningless, since the mind is meaningless, we do not accept that two moments of mind can be simultaneous. Or then to follow the commentary here, if you say, what is it that sees, then we would conventionally say that it's the mind which sees. And the commentary explains that. Well now, what is it that sees, if you say that? Then the mind which sees ultimate reality is not itself ultimate reality. However, conventionally, we would say that it is the 탄에 돈담배 땜발라 니는 눈에 죽이
탄에 돈이 전담배 땜발라. 그러와 전담배 땜발이 좋아 민지 있어 샘데 전담배 말해 그러와 난도 막 좋아 말해 탄에 대한 전담 땜발라 니는 눈에 죽이 냠자기로 깨지 그 쟁가 쳐봐디 아니 전담배 통과래.
So however so it's not the mind which sees ultimate reality, it is not ultimate reality. However, we would say conventionally that it is a cognition, the cognition specifically of that meditative equipoise, which is which has as its referent ultimate reality, and which knows it by means of the dissolution or disappearance of dual appearance. That cognition itself exists such that it functions in the terms of arising and ceasing moment to moment. And that is what we would say is the thing that sees ultimate reality.
Oh yeah, 这样对呢下巴怎么引起？想下一些天，对呢下巴怎么引起？让心去做嘛的？ 샘중 매봐 샘미중아 샘 매봐야 샘중 미중에 아니 라시 아니 미중아 인장 샘중주 판도对主자 인장 라신지 주비 태와 말이 是吧 샘니지장 통화 마인데 샘니지장 샘 통화 마인데 세가나 단단 대방 무슨도 도미 이시티 냠샤기 생活 샘니 통화 말이 냠샤기 천이습이 생活 안에 샘도 통화 말이 是吧 这他就얘기大了那就그래 是吧 근데 샘니지 샘 통화 많이 세대 냠샤그 천이 세비 생활로 안에 샘도 통화 말에 샘미점 랑거랑 미리비 체당 샘니 현지도 미리 냠샤그 천이 통해 샘 대당 아니 가서래 천이 통해 샘 대당 천이 니고도 냠샤그 생활 현지도 요 말에 나 자야 저래 라 현지도 미리비 체를 천이 대당 냠샤그 시고 천이 시비 생활로 천이 대당 아니 천이 시비 샘디 현지도 아니 정말 믿어도
주니식 비심디
생활은
현직도
현지도 미중 천이당 천이 요와디 천이 시비 생활로 천이 시비 샘디 요 말에
So then, so we say that conventionally, then we would say that it's that cognition of the meditative equipoise which sees ultimate reality in this manner of the disappearance of dual appearance, and that itself is something that arises and ceases moment to moment. And so that is what we say is what sees ultimate reality. And that is merely posited contingently. Even that is merely posited contingently, but it is not established by means of its own intrinsic nature. There's no mind. Mind does not arise without mental factors. The mental factors, and likewise, the mental factors do not arise without mind. Therefore, and because that's the case, they're meaningless in the sense of being established by means of their own intrinsic nature. And the mind itself it does not see mind. This statement here refers to that mind itself is a term referring, mind itself is a term here referring to that gnosis of meditative equipoise. So within the perspective of that gnosis of meditative equipoise, which is observing the nature of things, that is emptiness here. Here, that observation of nature, nature itself is what is appearing within that cognition, within that experience, but the mind itself is not appearing within that cognition. That is the 심리기 심통.
썸미점을 대승이배 썸미점이
주니식 싱모.
천이십이 생활로 유동바지 예장 유전 동용무슨 또비 이시리 요 말에
So within that cognition, which is that vision, within the perspective of that vision, which is observing nature, that is, nature here is a term for emptiness, then it sees nature, that is emptiness, but the mind itself is not observed, it does not appear within that cognition. That is, only the nature as such is appearing within that cognition.
썸미점이 랑기랑라 미리바데 텔레파페자 그래서 썸미점이 랑기랑라 미리바데 천이십이 생활로 아니 가서 냠샤 소소랑 그 시티게 라니 미리바 배자입니다.
So the example that's given here, it's just like the tip of a finger does not touch itself. The tip of a finger does not touch itself. Similarly, within the perspective of that vision of nature, which is observing nature, we have to specify that. There's nothing, it doesn't observe itself. It doesn't observe itself. That is, the gnosis is not not what it's seeing or seeing. Rather, it's just nature itself.
야, 가서래 현실이 생활 이제도 세나 이제도 현실이 생활 요거래 대나 현실이 생활 군조 요거래 아니 군조 요와데 가자이 바가사
The reason this is the case is because that gnosis is a phenomenal thing, and if the gnosis observed itself, that is the gnosis, then it would be something that would be established as real, and then it would end up being an object of negation. So that's why the gnosis cannot observe it, see itself.
야, 다 대샤샤 지베지 조심해 담아리 인데제 인데 산제 제와